This is 6.7, identifying the leading coefficient test. And what the leading coefficient test does is it describes the end behavior of a graph. I don't want you to write this objective down or this example. So let's say we have a function, f of x equals x cubed. And we want to identify, does this graph end with a snake like this, where the end behavior rises on the right and falls on the left? Or does this graph have a snake shape that looks like this, where it rises on the left and falls on the right? So on the next slide are the graphs of higher order polynomials. We're going to focus more on the quadratics, cubics, quartics, and quintics. So I would recommend you write down the graph of this first one. It's a parabola. That was focusing on chapter 5, where the function is f of x equals x squared. We call it a quadratic, and the shape is in a U, or you can also call it a parabola. The degree of this quadratic function is degree 2, and that comes from the highest term in that function. So go ahead and write those pieces down that I just highlighted. The next graph is the shape of a snake. So here's what a snake shape would look like. The function equation would look like f of x equals x to the third power. We call it a cubic function. Its shape is an S, or you can also refer to it as a snake. The degree now is degree of 3. That comes from the highest term in the polynomial, x to the third power. Go ahead and write those pieces down. In the next lesson, we are going to take the time and graph these higher order polynomials. And you need to know about what the graph looks like, denoting the degree. The next graph is what we call the quartic function. The function looks like f of x equals x raised to the fourth power. We call it a quartic function. Its shape is a W, or it should also be the letter M, depending if it opens down. The degree is 4, because the highest term, its power, is 4. So if you did have an M, the graph would look something more like this. The last higher order polynomial that we talk about is a 5th degree polynomial. The function looks like x raised to the 5th power. We call it a quintic function. Its shape then goes back and mirrors the cubic function that we saw up here. And its shape is an S or a snake. The degree is 5. So I'll give you a little bit of time to finish writing that slide down. It is a very important slide, so you can recognize the graphs and what they look like later on. Okay, if you're not done writing, just go ahead and pause now and then continue playing when you've written down this slide. I am going to move on for those who have had the time to write up this slide. Okay, let's move on to the leading coefficient test. What the leading coefficient test does is it tells the right and the left-hand behavior of the graph. Does it rise on the right? Does it fall on the left? So go ahead and write that box down. And then I just want to review with you with this function. The leading coefficient, I need to write the function down. The leading coefficient, if we put this in standard form, the leading coefficient is the coefficient in front of the highest term. The degree, remember, is the power, the highest power. So we do need to recognize those two pieces to our chart below. We're looking at the leading coefficient and its degree. And then there's a box down below that I do want you to write down. And then on the next slides, we're going to go ahead and use those. All right, in this set of 4 boxes, I'm going to explain what they mean. In the red is identifying what the degree is. So if the degree, that's your n, if your degree is odd, so you're looking at examples like a cubic function or a quintic. Again, if the degree is odd, it's going to be a cubic or a quintic. Then a sub n represents the leading coefficient. So if that leading coefficient is a positive number, or is the leading coefficient a negative number? Here are the 2 scenarios. In the black, it tells you what the behavior is. So let's talk about this box first. If I have a quintic or a cubic function and the leading coefficient is positive, it tells me then that the end behavior is going to fall on the left side. So if we have this x-axis, it's going to fall here on this side, and then it's going to rise on the right. It's going to look something like that. All right, the second box in the upper right-hand corner. Let's explain that one. So again, it is a quintic or a cubic function, x to the third, x to the fifth, but now my leading coefficient is negative. So the opposite's going to happen. I'm going to rise on the left side, and I'm going to fall on the right. So if I look at this as a graph, remember those are going to be snakes. It's going to rise on the left and fall on the right. So then a little squiggle will happen, something like that. That's the shape. This is the end behavior, rising on the left, falling on the right. The last 2 boxes are when the degree is even. So when the degree is even, we're talking things like quadratics, x squared, or quartics, x to the 4th. So again, when the degree is even, we're talking quadratics, we're talking quartics. And then the same thing applies. A sub n is greater than 0, so that means the leading coefficient is positive. If a sub n is less than 0, then your leading coefficient is negative. So now let's go ahead and describe the end behavior. So let's talk about this far left box. Our degree is even and our leading coefficient is positive. So it tells me I'm going to rise on the left-hand side and rise on the right-hand side. So if we think about the quadratic, the parabolas, if here is my graph, I know the shape is a U. It has to rise on this left side. It has to rise on this right side. So that tells me my parabola opens up. If I'm talking a quartic, it'll look something more like this, where you have your rise on the left and rise on the right, and then there's kind of like a little W that happens there. All right, our last box on the right. Again, we're talking quadratics and quartics. The leading coefficient now is negative. So remember when we did quadratics in chapter 5, we said the leading coefficient, that a value is negative? Remember what happens to our parabola? It opens down. So our end behavior here is it's going to fall on the left and fall on the right. So this would be for a quadratic equation, a parabola. And then if we're talking a quartic, a fourth degree polynomial, again, it falls on the left, it falls on the right, but now we have a shape of an M. Please go ahead and finish writing up this slide. It's a very important slide. And then on the next video, we're going to go ahead and practice finding the end behavior using this leading coefficient test, this 4 boxes. So you're going to refer to this later.